Hey, Chapter 4, Apes, Ecosystems. We're going to talk about things like insects and cows and consumers and heterotrophs and autotrophs and food chains and food webs. Lots of good stuff. Just realize in Chapter 4, we're going to go through it in several parts. We're going to skip, for now, the part on soil, but we will come back to it. The first thing that the chapter really starts talking about is insects. Now, insects, of all the living organisms on Earth, aside from bacteria, they make up the most or the largest majority of living species. A lot of us don't like insects. You can see the mighty picture of the mosquito, which is a huge annoyance to us. And of course, Wisconsin is a huge breeding ground for those little creatures. Brookfield, of course, you guys spray for those guys to try to get rid of them a little bit. They do things like spreading malaria in other countries and tropical regions. In Wisconsin, they can obviously be an annoyance and not do a whole lot of harm besides that to us, but you know, they have a good and bad side. The good side of insects is they're huge parts of our pollination chain. Without them, we'd be in big trouble. Insects, particularly things like bees, do a lot of that pollinating. We are actually in Wisconsin having huge problems with that right now, with the amount of pesticides that are being put on and maybe even the genetically modified organisms that we're using. The amount of bees in Wisconsin is actually on the decline, so we actually have to bring them in from other states like Illinois and Minnesota to do our pollinating. Again, we wouldn't get things like corn and potatoes and all those pretty flowers outside your house without these. They're part of our food chain too. Believe it or not, mosquitoes are part of the food chain. Bats eat mosquitoes, and of course bats are real important to us also because they're pollinators. Not so good, obviously a huge nuisance. When we put pesticides on, it causes what's called a pesticide treadmill, where we put pesticides on, they evolve, they become resistant, we have to put more pesticides on, and it just keeps going and going and going. And that gets into our groundwater, which obviously is not good for us to ingest. Known species, here they are. Insects, 751,000, I believe it is, known species of insects. Other animals, 281,000. Fungi, 69,000. Prokaryotes, there's 4,800. However, remember, prokaryotes actually technically outnumber all of us in total numbers, not different species, but in total numbers. Plants, 248,000 known. Protists, about 57,000 known species. But again, the insects are kind of the dominant, if you will, the most number of species out there. But there are good and bad. So Nature of Science is section 4.1, and it's, as you're going to see in this class, we're going to start out with hardcore science, with ecology and food webs and food chains and how we affect them, and kind of transition over to more of an environmentalist point of view afterwards, dealing with pesticides and pollutions and energy usage and energy efficiency and just a whole bunch of stuff down the road. But we need to set the pace with ecology. Ecology is the how organisms interact with one another in the non-living. Just by walking outside, you affect our environment. By building a house, we affect our environment. By cutting down a forest, we affect our environment and ruin habitat. Ecologists are those scientists that study interactions within the ecosystem. Again, they kind of look at deforestation in the tropical regions, where how is it going to affect the rest of the world. We know with cutting down tropical regions, we're getting rid of potential medical sources. Maybe the cure for cancer is out there in the jungles. We don't want to destroy those jungles and get rid of those. The next idea is something called the realm of ecology. So if you take a look at the chart on the right, we start out in an individual point of view, and I'm on the bottom of the page. Any form of life is an organism. That could be eukaryotes, that could be prokaryotes. Again, prokaryotes are bacteria. Populations are groups of interacting individuals. We have, for example, the picture on the right, one deer in the state of Wisconsin is an organism. All the deer in the state of Wisconsin is a population. They interact together. Genetic diversity is very critical, especially if something like a disease were to come through or a genetic mutation. We want diversity, so not the entire species population is wiped out. Habitat, of course, is where it lives. The distribution of range is where each species is found. We're finding the black bear population is moving further south in Wisconsin. It's kind of near the Wausau, Stevens Point area, all the way over to Green Bay right now. And what they're doing is they're looking for food, and it's got good habitat up there. Not sure if it will reach all the way down here. Communities are populations of different species interacting together. So think about Wisconsin, all the raccoons and all the skunks and all the plants and all the deer and all the dogs and cats and everything interacting together, including us too. Ecosystems, then, what we do is it's the different species interacting, and we throw in the non-living aspects. So how does temperature affect us? How does rainfall affect us? How does, of course, winter affect Wisconsin, where some animals have to go into a partial hibernation, including this guy? And then, of course, everything is the biosphere or the ecosphere. That's everything put together and how they interact. We're going to talk about the hydrosphere, which is water and the land and just everything that comes together throughout this chain. Microbes, let's talk bacteria, the good and the bad. Things like bacteria, fungi, yeast, and protists. Bacteria and fungi are the main decomposers that we have. Yeast you oftentimes obviously associate with cooking bread. Protists are those teeny tiny little creatures that when you go swimming in the lakes and rivers around here, you happen to swallow some of them. Can be very beneficial to our environment. The good is they can act as food. They can act as the decomposers. Food, fungi like mushrooms, if you eat those. If you eat yogurt, of course, that's got really good bacterial cultures in them. They convert nitrogen gas into a usable form. As you'll learn when we do the nitrogen cycle, our plants need nitrogen to grow. We need nitrogen to continue living. For example, our DNA is made up of a nitrogen base. Medicines are found from these things above. Of course, the great penicillium discovery, which gets rid of bacteria, was made many, many years ago and, of course, still in use. Wastewater treatment plants, which we'll hit down the road one of our last chapters, and we're going to talk about how we actually use bacteria to break down our waste. That's the number 2 that goes down the toilet. Not so good, things like diseased, increased plant loss because of this. When I was in college, I got to do research on potatoes, which doesn't sound real exciting, but it actually was very cool. In big picture, what we were looking at was a fungus that actually invades the potato roots and kills them, and it reduces overall crop yield, which is very significant when you're trying to feed a family or a population. Earth's life support system 4.2 we'll just hit real quick. You can see the picture of the Earth there. You probably learned some of this back in Earth science days. The atmosphere, obviously, there's different levels. There's a level called the troposphere. That's what you're standing or sitting in right now. Anywhere from sea level up to 11 miles up, roughly, is our troposphere. Most of the planet's air is in here, and that's because gravity pulls those molecules down. It's made up of about 78% nitrogen and about 21% oxygen. Above our atmosphere, as you can see, we have a stratosphere. That's about 11 to 30 miles up, which is hard to fathom that distance. But think about it this way. Airplanes kind of fly just at the top of the troposphere, kind of up about 35,000 feet, about 5 miles up. And the air gets thinner as we go up there. So we're still in the troposphere. Jets like airplanes, military planes can actually fly higher, almost up to the stratospheric level. What the stratosphere does for us is it has that beautiful thing called ozone, which is O3. It filters radiation from the sun before it gets to us. That's a huge thing. As we'll talk about down the road, of course, there is something called an ozone hole, which is letting that radiation in, of course, increasing our skin cancer rates. Keep in mind that as we look at the planet Earth, our atmosphere actually thins near the polar regions, and airplanes actually take advantage of that. If you ever fly over to like London from Chicago, you'll actually go north because the air is thinner, there's less resistance, and the plane can actually get better gas mileage and fly faster. So the atmosphere above the stratosphere, we have something called the mesosphere. That's where rocks and meteors burn up, so you can see those shooting stars, if you will, up there. Thermosphere is above that. The auroras occur there. Of course, we have the northern lights, they're commonly called here. There's also southern lights down in the southern hemisphere. We can really see those well, particularly in the wintertime around here when it's really clear and cold out. And what that is the sun's rays actually bouncing off of the polar ice caps, and they're really pretty if you've ever seen them. They're kind of pinkish in color, mint kind of in color. Exosphere is the upper limits of the atmosphere, so that's way up there, and obviously the exosphere is the point where the satellites and everything are right above we use. The hydrosphere, if you ever see the word hydro, obviously that means water. That's Earth's water. It could be captured as ice, it could be liquid, it could be vapor form. So that's the hydrosphere. Any even water vapor in the air, any liquid that's out there in our lakes around here, in our rivers around here, obviously the oceans. The hydrosphere makes up a majority of our Earth's planets. The lithosphere, if you ever see that, that's the land part. This is where we get non-renewable, renewable energy from, such as minerals, such as coal and oil, natural gas. That's where our soil is. The crust in the upper mantle is the soil. So if you take a look at the picture on the right, you can see the core in the middle, and then the mantle is above that. And then the crust is a layer of soil and rock above that, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit as we get a little bit deeper. A couple of things about solar radiation. A lot of it, obviously, we require solar radiation. Plants require it in order to go through photosynthesis. It keeps us warm. About 34% of that sun's radiation is actually reflected back out into the atmosphere. And a lot of it, of course, comes in and we use it in the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is arguably a very good thing because it actually captures the heat and keeps us warm. We'll talk about that down the road. I'm going to actually stop there, and we'll start with this next part, interconnected life factors, in part 2.